The dogs noticed her before anyone else did. That was the part nobody could explain afterward. Not the handlers, not the ceremony coordinator, not even the base commander, who had overseen hundreds of canine demonstrations across his career. 7 highly trained German shepherds, each one a decorated working dog with hundreds of hours of field experience, each one conditioned to hold formation through gunfire and crowd noise and every distraction the world could throw at them. And every single one of them turned their head at the exact same moment, toward the same woman standing alone at the back of the crowd. She wasn't in uniform. She wasn't carrying anything that would draw attention. She was wearing a gray jacket that was at least one size too big, jeans with a torn knee, and boots that had seen too many winters. Her dark hair was pulled back in a way that suggested she hadn't thought much about it that morning. She looked like someone who had shown up to the wrong event and hadn't yet decided whether to stay. The ceremony was held at Pendleton Naval Air Station on a Tuesday in early November, one of those cold, bright mornings where the sky looks like it was scrubbed clean overnight. The occasion was the formal retirement of 3 working K9s, Atlas, Ranger, and a Belgian Malinois named Duke, who had served 2 overseas rotations and come home with a limp he would carry the rest of his life. There were flags and folding chairs, and a color guard that snapped to attention with the kind of precision that makes civilians instinctively straighten their own posture. There were officers in dress blues and a small crowd of family members and base personnel who had gathered to mark the occasion properly. It was a good ceremony, dignified. The kind of thing that made you feel, if only for an hour, that the world still organized itself around things that mattered. Nobody paid attention to the woman near the back fence. Her name was Cara Whitfield. She was 28 years old. She had driven 4 hours from a town outside of Sacramento that morning, alone, and she had arrived 40 minutes early and waited in her car until the ceremony started before she found a place to stand at the edge of the crowd where she wouldn't be noticed. She had not been invited. She had not told anyone she was coming. If anyone had asked, she would have said she was just passing through, which was not entirely a lie. She was always passed through somewhere, had been for the past 3 years. The truth was more complicated than that, but the truth usually is. She had spent the previous night in a motel off the interstate, staring at the ceiling, telling herself she wasn't going to come. She had made that same argument every year for 3 years, and every year she lost it somewhere around dawn. So she drove. She always drove. She stood at the back of the crowd and watched the ceremony the way you watch something you've given up your right to be part of. From a distance, with your hands in your pockets, letting the sound reach you, but not letting yourself reach back. That was when the first dog turned. His name was Apollo. He was a 4-year-old male German shepherd who had been deployed to 2 different field assignments and had never once broken formation during a public event. His handler, Sergeant Derek Okafor, would later describe what happened as something he had no language for. One moment Apollo was standing at rigid attention beside him, absolutely textbook, the way he always was. The next, the dog's head swung hard to the left, toward the back of the crowd, and his body followed. Okafor tightened the lead. Apollo took 1 step toward the fence anyway, and then stopped, trembling. Okafor looked up to see what the dog was looking at. He saw a young woman in a gray jacket. She wasn't doing anything. She was just standing there, very still, with her hands in her pockets. "Hold," Okafor said quietly. Apollo held, but his whole body was vibrating like a wire under tension. Then Juniper turned. Juniper was a 6-year-old female shepherd who had never shown interest in anything during a formal ceremony except the task in front of her. She turned, and she made a sound. Not a bark, not a growl. Something lower and more urgent, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest, where feelings live that didn't have names. Her handler, a young corporal named Travis Keene, looked over at Okafor. Okafor shook his head slightly, meaning he didn't know either. Then the 3rd dog turned, then the 4th. The ceremony had not stopped. The base commander was still speaking at the podium about service and sacrifice, and the particular bond between a working dog and the men and women they protected. Most of the crowd had not noticed what was happening yet. The few who had were watching the dogs with the careful expression of people waiting to understand something they haven't been told yet. Cara had not moved. She was watching the ceremony with her eyes fixed forward, or trying to, but something in her posture had changed. Her shoulders had come up slightly, the way they do when you feel eyes on you, and you're trying to decide whether to acknowledge it. She looked down. Apollo was staring directly at her from across the plaza. His ears were forward. His tail was moving in slow, steady arcs. Not frantic, not aggressive, but deliberate, the way a dog moves its tail when it is communicating something it considers important. She recognized him. Her hand came up to cover her mouth. By the time 5 dogs had turned, Sergeant Okafor had stepped out of formation to approach his commanding officer, a tall man named Lieutenant Commander Paul Reyes, who had been standing to the side of the main group and had already clocked what was happening. "Sir," Okafor said quietly, "I don't know what's going on." Reyes was looking at the woman near the back fence. "Neither do I," he said, "but let's find out." He walked toward her, and the look on his face was not unfriendly, but it was precise, the look of a man who needed information quickly and preferred to get it without making a scene. He was halfway across the plaza when the 6th dog turned, and then the 7th, and then all 7 animals were facing the same direction. All 7 leads pulled taut, 7 handlers holding on with both hands, and none of them entirely sure they were going to keep holding. Reyes reached the woman first. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice low, "I need to ask you, do you have some kind of connection to these animals?" She had been crying. Not loudly, not dramatically. There were just tears on her face, and she hadn't wiped them away. She looked at the dogs and then at Reyes, and then back at the dogs. "I trained them," she said. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Reyes looked at her for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said carefully. "Could you repeat that? I trained them." She cleared her throat. 4 of them. Apollo and Juniper I had from 8 weeks. Mika and Scout came to me at 14 months. I had them all for at least 18 months of foundational work before they went into placement. She paused. The other 3 I didn't train personally, but I consulted on their programs. I know their handlers' notes better than my own handwriting. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Behind him, the ceremony had stuttered to a halt. The base commander had stopped speaking. People were turning to see what had drawn the attention of a senior officer to the back of the crowd. "What's your name?" Reyes said. "Cara Whitfield." She finally tidwiped her face with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry. I didn't come here to cause a disruption. I wanted to see them. I didn't think they would." She stopped, looked at Apollo. "I didn't think they'd remember me." The story did not begin at a naval base. It began in a converted barn outside of Redding, California, where Cara Whitfield had spent most of her childhood learning things her father had taught her, and then spent most of her 20s trying to figure out which of those things were worth keeping. Her father, Gene Whitfield, had trained working dogs for 30 years, not the kind of training that ends with a certification and a placement fee. The other kind, the slow, unglamorous, deeply personal work of taking an animal that has been neglected or mishandled or simply never shown what it was capable of and building it into something extraordinary. He was not famous. He did not have a website or a social media presence or a television segment. He had a barn and a reputation that traveled entirely by word of mouth and a waiting list that was sometimes 2 years long. Cara had grown up inside that work. She knew by the time she was 12 how to read the difference between a dog that was afraid and a dog that was in pain, and why that difference mattered. She knew how to earn trust without demanding it. She knew that the first lesson you taught an animal wasn't sit or heel or stay. It was that you were safe. Everything else came after that. When Jean died of a cardiac event in the winter 3 years before the ceremony at Pendleton, he left her the property, the equipment, the remaining dogs in training, and a business that she was not prepared to run alone. That part wasn't his fault. She had worked beside him for years, but she had let him carry the weight of the operation, the way you let a parent carry things when you're not ready to be the one who holds them. And then he was gone, and the weight was just there, on the ground, and she didn't know how to pick it up. She tried. For 8 months, she tried. She made placements she shouldn't have made because she needed the income. She turned down contract she should have taken because she was too exhausted to think clearly. She missed signs in 2 separate animals that her father would have caught in a single morning's observation, and both of those placements had to be recalled and started over. The recalled dogs weren't harmed, but the failure of her own judgment frightened her in a way that she couldn't shake. She found a solution, the way people in crisis often do, that solved the immediate problem and created several larger ones. A man named Douglas Hart, who presented himself as a private contractor with federal connections and an interest in developing a regional K-9 procurement program, approached her in the spring. He was plausible. He had documentation that looked legitimate, references that checked out on the surface, and a contract that offered to take on the operational costs of the remaining training program in exchange for first rights of placement. He said the dogs would go to law enforcement and military units. He said this was exactly the kind of program Jean Whitfield had always deserved to be connected to. She signed. She was 25, alone, grieving, and running out of reasons not to. For the first 3 months, it seemed to work. Hart's team handled the logistics. The dogs were well fed, their programs continued, and 2 placements were made that she could verify. She did not see the dogs after transfer, but that was common. She told herself that was normal. She told herself she was learning to let go. Then the dogs stopped coming back from transfer, and no new contracts appeared. And when she asked Douglas Hart where 12 animals that should have been in placement were, he told her not to worry about it. And when she pushed harder, his manner changed. The plausible man became a different person entirely. He told her that she had signed over operational authority, that the dogs were no longer her concern, and that if she wanted to make that a legal problem, she was welcome to try. She tried. She contacted the county sheriff's office and was told there was no evidence of a crime. She contacted the state attorney general's office and was assigned a case number she never heard about again. She called every federal contact she could find, most of whom didn't return her calls, 2 of whom listened politely and then told her that without documentation of harm to the animals, there was nothing to pursue. She spent 4 months fighting a system that didn't believe the dogs were worth fighting for, and then ran out of money, and then ran out of fight. What she never fully ran out of was the knowledge that somewhere, in some condition she couldn't verify, were 12 animals she had raised from puppies, animals that had learned to trust because she had taught them that trust was safe to offer. She moved out of the barn. She took a job at a veterinary clinic in Sacramento. She kept the barn's address as her mailing address because she couldn't make herself formally leave. She drove past it sometimes on weekends, checking that it was still standing, checking that the lock she'd put on the gate was still holding. She stopped telling people about the dogs. The story was too long, and it had no ending yet, and people got uncomfortable when you told them a story that didn't have an ending. The investigation that eventually caught Douglas Hart was not launched because of Cara Whitfield's complaints. It was launched 14 months later when a federal agricultural inspector in Arizona found documentation irregularities in an animal transport operation that was moving dogs across state lines using fraudulent veterinary certifications. The inspector flagged it. A different agency picked it up. Hart was identified 6 months after that as a central figure in a broader operation that had been brokering working-breed dogs to private buyers, some domestic and some overseas, under false pretenses about their training histories and provenance. 7 of the 12 dogs had ended up, through various indirect channels, in legitimate working placements. 1 had been purchased by a private security company in Germany. That one was still overseas. 1 had died, not by violence, but from a congenital condition that no one had caught, and that her father would have caught, and that she thought about more than she allowed herself to think about. 3 more were recovered from a holding facility in Nevada, thin but not broken, and placed eventually with a rescue organization that specialized in working breed rehabilitation. 7 of the 12 had landed in real work. Good work, military and law enforcement placements that, by the time the investigation concluded, were already 2 years into active service. She found out about the recovery through a victim notification letter that arrived at the barn address 9 months before the Pendleton ceremony. The letter told her about the legal outcomes, the recoveries, and in a single paragraph noted that several of the animals had been identified as having originated from her father's training program based on microchip records and training documentation seized from Harte's operation. She read that paragraph 4 times. Then she folded the letter and put it in the drawer where she kept things that mattered, and picked up her phone and held it for a long time before setting it down without calling anyone. There was no one to call. Her father was gone. The dogs were placed. The case was closed, but she knew, because the letter had included a public record number where some of them had ended up. She started following public schedules for K9 unit events, the way you follow something you're not sure you're allowed to care about anymore. She didn't reach out to anyone. She didn't file any formal request to be notified or included. She just looked, sometimes, at public ceremony announcements and held the information quietly. The Pendleton ceremony had been posted on the base's public affairs page 3 weeks in advance. She told herself she was going to stay in the car. Lieutenant Commander Paul Reyes made a decision in the 30 seconds after Cara Whitfield told him she had trained these animals, the kind of decision that is made before. It is fully thought through, operating on some instinct below the level of protocol. He turned back toward the ceremony and raised his hand. "At ease," he said loudly enough to carry. "I need a moment." He looked at Sergeant Okafor. "Release your leads." Okafor looked at him. "Sir, release your leads, all of you now." There was a half-second of collective hesitation. 7 handlers looked at each other and then at their commanding officer, and then released 7 leads at the same moment. What happened next was not chaos. It was the opposite of chaos. It was 7 animals moving with a single, quiet certainty toward the woman at the back of the crowd, not running, not leaping, but moving at a fast walk that broke into a trot and then slowed again as they reached her, as though they understood that she needed a moment to brace herself. She had already gone down to her knees. She didn't do it consciously. Her legs simply decided for her. Apollo reached her first. He pressed his face against her face and held it there. She made a sound that nobody who heard it could describe afterward in a way that felt adequate. It was the sound of something that had been held for a long time being set down. The other dogs arrived around her in a loose circle, each one making contact in their own particular way. Scout with his head in her lap, Juniper pacing once around her before settling at her left side, a younger dog named Bear who had not been trained by her, but seemed to feel some pull toward the group and sat just outside the circle with his ears forward, watching. The crowd had gone completely silent, not the polite silence of ceremony. The other kind, the base commander, a man with 30 years of service who had spent most of those years training himself not to show emotion in public, took off his cover and held it in both hands in front of him. Someone in the crowd was crying. More than one someone. Cara had her arms around Apollo and her face pressed into his coat, and she was not trying to hold herself together anymore. 3 years of holding herself together had apparently reached some limit that even she hadn't known was there. Reyes crouched down beside her. He didn't say anything immediately. He just waited. After a while, she lifted her head. Her face was a mess and she didn't seem to care. "They remember," she said. Not to Reyes, really, more like a thought that had escaped out loud. "They remember," he said. She looked at the dogs around her and then at the crowd that had gathered without meaning to, all these people in uniform watching her with expressions she didn't quite know how to hold. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to." "Don't," Reyes said. He said it quietly, not unkindly. "Don't apologize for this." She looked at Apollo. He was watching her with the steady, uncomplicated attention that dogs offer when they have decided you are theirs, which does not expire and does not require maintenance and does not care what you have done or failed to do in the years between the last time and this time. It is simply there, waiting like a door that was never locked. "I thought they'd forget me," she said. "I thought." She stopped. "I had them for almost 2 years, and then I lost them. I lost all of them, and I thought by now they'd have bonded to their handlers, and I'd just be a smell they maybe half remembered." She ran her hand down Apollo's back. "I thought that would be okay. I wanted it to be okay." Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What you built in them, the foundation, it didn't go away." She nodded slowly. "My father used to say that. He said the work you do in the beginning is the work that lasts." She swallowed. "I didn't know if he was right." "He was right," Okafor said. He had come to stand a few feet away, hands at his sides, and there was something in his expression that was not quite professional anymore. "Apollo's been with me for 2 years. Best dog I've ever worked with. I used to wonder who trained him. Whatever they did it right." He paused. "I think I know now." One by one over the next few minutes, the other handlers came forward and said some version of the same thing. Not formally, not with speeches, just person to person, standing in a loose and somewhat improbable gathering, in the middle of an interrupted ceremony, talking about their dogs with a woman they had met 4 minutes ago and somehow didn't feel like they'd just met. The base commander eventually made his way through the group. He was a big man with a grey crew cut and the particular bearing of someone who has spent decades being the one people look to when they need to be told what to do. He stood in front of Cara Whitfield, who was still on the ground with Apollo's head in her lap, and he looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "I don't know the full extent of your history with these animals, but I know what I watched today, and I know what it tells me." He cleared his throat. "I'd like to hear your story, if you're willing to tell it, and I'd like to make sure that the people who need to know it do." Cara looked up at him. She had stopped crying. Her face had a stillness to it that was different from the stillness she'd had standing alone at the back of the crowd, less guarded, somehow, more like the stillness of a person who has just put something down. "There's a part with a missing dog," she said. "One I never found." "Tell me that part too," the commander said. She nodded. She sat on the cold concrete of the plaza with 7 dogs around her, and she told him. She told him about her father, and the barn, and the man with the legitimate-looking paperwork, and the case number that went nowhere. She told him about the notification letter and the dogs she'd tracked through public records, and the 4-hour drive that morning that she'd told herself she wasn't going to make. She told him about the dog who had died, the one with the congenital condition she hadn't caught in time, and she told him that part steadily, without looking away, because she had learned from her father that you owed an honest account of the things you got wrong. Reyes was taking notes on his phone. She noticed but didn't ask why. She would find out later that within 48 hours of that conversation, Reyes had connected the information she provided to the federal case file that had been formally closed 9 months earlier, and had filed a request to have it reviewed in light of the missing placement documentation for the dog that had gone overseas. She would find out that the dog, a shepherd named Cedar, whom she had raised from 7 weeks old, was located at a private security contractor in Munich and was, by all accounts, healthy and working and apparently very good at her job. She would find out that the contractor, when contacted, was cooperative and somewhat surprised to learn the full history of the animal they'd purchased, and agreed without significant negotiation to transfer Cedar to a domestic placement that would allow Cara to maintain verified contact going forward. She did not find out any of that for several weeks. What she found out that afternoon, standing in the parking lot after the ceremony had formally concluded, late, rearranged, somewhat different from what anyone had planned, was that Sergeant Okafor wanted to know if she'd be willing to consult on Apollo's ongoing program, that the corporal named Keene had written down her email address in his phone with more care than he'd given anything that week, that the base commander had shaken her hand and held it a moment longer than handshakes usually last, and said that her father sounded like someone worth knowing. He was, she said. She drove back toward Sacramento in the early dark. The heater in her car didn't work well, and she had the gray jacket zipped to her chin and the radio off, because she wanted to be inside the quiet of the day for a little while before she had to be anywhere else. She was not the same person who had driven the other direction that morning. She couldn't have said precisely what was different. The barn was still empty. The barn address was still her mailing address. The missing dog was still missing, technically, though less so than before. The things that had broken were not unbroken, but she had seen Apollo's face when he found her, and she knew the truth her father had spent 30 years trying to explain. The work you do at the beginning is the work that lasts. The connection you build in the early days, when the animal is learning what safety feels like, that does not simply transfer to the next handler and disappear. It remains. It waits. It knows you when you come back. She thought about that for a long time as the highway unspooled in front of her. She had raised those dogs to trust. She had built something in them that had lasted through confusion and transfer, and years of different handlers, and the particular forgetting that life requires of all of us. It had lasted, and when she'd walked up to that fence that morning and stood at the back of a crowd she had no right to be part of, every single thing she had ever given them had come back to her at once. She pulled off at a rest stop, somewhere south of Stockton, and sat in the dark for a while with her hands in her lap. She had not thought, when she left that morning, that she was going to get anything back. She had driven 4 hours to stand at the edge of something that had once been hers, and let herself look at it one more time. That was all she had asked for. She had not known that the dogs were still looking for her, too.